what sparked my interest? I was one of those people back in the day that went overland from Europe to Asia. There was no Lonely Planet in those days. You basically, people coming from the other direction, you would ask them where they stayed, where they, what's it like here, how does one get to this or that, and eventually found myself in India. I mean, I started off, going through Europe, and when I got to Istanbul, after hitchhiking, from Istanbul on, public transportation cost next to nothing. And so you wound up taking all sorts of public transportation. Afghanistan was a wonderful place if you were male. But for the most part, most travelers had no problems there. But sort of towards the end, when I got to Delhi, one of the people in the hotel I was staying with, who was going back to the States, said, "Oh, you should go to Tibet House. It's really interesting." And so I went, and it was interesting. And then, as I went on, I went up to Kathmandu, and I was in Darjeeling and Bodh Gaya, and ultimately, towards the end, I wound up in Dharamsala, in McLeod Ganj. And if I can say so, please don't be offended, but it was a wonderful place then. It's like a circus now, so many things built up. One of the great things about being in McLeod Ganj is you were in nature. There were trees all around. Very few buildings. Most of the Westerners stayed in the Kailash Hotel, and that was sufficient for all the Westerners in McLeod Ganj in those days. I just became more and more fascinated. I felt as if I knew a little bit about India, and I knew a little bit about China, about the origins of Chinese civilization, of Indic civilization, but Tibet was like this big blank, and being there, I just became more and more fascinated. So, yeah.
First of all, thank you for giving us this lecture, and my question is, from where do you get your sources?
You mean which sort of sources do I use, or how do I get them?
Yeah, how do you get them?
Okay, well, Chinese sources are, Chinese sources are reasonably available, but there are a lot of modern versions of sources which are, quite useful, which you have to get from the People's Republic of China. I've had problems ordering books. And it's not so much a problem ordering them, it's a problem of knowing what is published. But for instance, when I talk about the veritable records of the Ming Dynasty, there is it's 2 volumes of the records and 1 volume index that was published in the 1980s. A lot of these modern tools, research tools, which you can get, are very, very useful. Many of the basic Chinese sources, the dynastic histories, those are available in many editions. Although, if it makes a difference to anybody, the Zhonghua Shuzhu editions of the 70s and 80s I find to be the best. They're punctuated, and they use the old style characters. Which is important, so that there's no confusion. The veritable records you have them for the Ming Dynasty, also for the Qing Dynasty. Extremely, extremely useful. They just extract, because, I think if you had the veritable records of the Qing Dynasty in the modern print edition, which they have, it would take up maybe the entire back wall. With volumes like this, and so here you have all the extracted, the Tibetan sources. Although you should always check with the original, and you should always be wary that it's possible that they've overlooked things. And I found things like that, but extremely, extremely useful. These are the basic pre-modern sources. Then there are studies that you can get in journals and other things, and for those you always have to be on the lookout. I'm fortunate, I live in New York, and we have the Lhotse Library, which collects a lot of the recent publications from the People's Republic of China in both Tibetan and Chinese. And because of my area, I have to work in both languages. Now, for classical Tibetan sources, of course, there are Often there are modern book editions which are published within the People's Republic of China, and then you have some published in India as well. In India and Nepal, in fact, the amount of publication, given the small size of the exile population, the amount of publication is actually quite impressive. So you'll have some of these texts which are printed in modern book editions, which of course is very convenient, because often when you're using a block print, it might not be as readable as you would like. Sometimes the ink from the other side shows through, sometimes it's smudged. Even though these, being the original editions, unless you have something earlier, are the ones you have to rely on. So you look at both of them. But for classical Tibetan literature, there's a wonderful resource, the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center, TBRC, which has, it was begun by really the great, how should I say, the greatest Tibetologist of our age, a man named E. Gene Smith, who is responsible for all of these reprinted texts from India that are in our libraries, reprinted block prints. He was the director of the Library of Congress field office in New Delhi, and for a long time he was the one who was collecting Tibetan. And he was an extremely generous scholar. Whenever someone would be in Delhi, if you would ask Gene a question, you'd go to see Gene at his office or even at his home, and you'd ask him a Tibetological question, he would just answer immediately, because all of these things published in PL 480, he read them. He would go through them. I mean, it's tremendous. And he had, I think the closest thing to a photographic memory. But he took the texts, and he began doing this in his later years, having them digitized. And then he put them online. So the website is the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center. And he passed away in December of 2010. And the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center continues. There are a group of dedicated scholars who are running it. And if you go online, you have thousands and thousands and thousands of Tibetan texts which are available to you there. And even pre-modern texts that have been republished in the People's Republic of China in modern book form, even those are available as well. There was a time when there's a copyright question, but now they're generally available. I don't know if the University of Zurich has access to that. Generally, university libraries subscribe, and then the students are allowed to use them. But it's an extremely, extremely important resource for Tibetan studies. And they have begun making the texts available in Romanized Tibetan and in computer font, so that you can actually do word searches, which one of my colleagues says this is the end of Tibetan studies. If you can just look for a term that you need, rather than actually read the book. As I said, what you have to do is you have to go through and through and through. He says this is going to be the death knell of Tibetan studies. People may stop reading the text, and they'll just, it's like just using the index.
They said that about Gutenberg and about history as well, so we can be optimistic, I guess. Are there any other questions? Remarks, Peter?
Yes, my question is, you mentioned that Minzu is the term, right, in Chinese, that it is about, in the last 15 years or so, changing...
The English translation.
The English translation from nationality to ethnicity. Now, I was just wondering, I always thought the translation nationality from the Russian nationalism is kind of misleading anyway, because it's also in Russian you wouldn't use it for citizenship, where you would rather use гражданство.
Yeah.
But it's really for the famous fifth line, right, where people have to write down which is really their ethnicity. But nationalnost is Russian actually used in two different ways.
I think it overlaps. I mean, if you're you can make the case, if you're a Kazakh or a Ukrainian, you can say this is my nationality. I'm not just an ethnic Ukrainian, I'm a Ukrainian or I'm a Kazakh. It's a way of dealing with empire.
Yeah, but you are a Kazakh by nationalnost even if you are a citizen of Russia.
Well, yeah, okay,
in that sense. My question was a different one, and that is there's two different meanings with the nationality. One is this kind of neutral ethnicity, that is the fifth line where everyone had, according to parents, usually father, etc., etc. But then there was this evolutionist idea of different levels of ethnicities, if you want to. So national was actually kind of the second level, those who didn't become a nation in the strict sense because they lacked, and that's those who didn't end up having a republic of their own. Is that also in Chinese?
In theory, you know, Ukraine and Belarus had seats in the United Nations.
That's right, exactly. And in the FIFA.
Yeah. Well, that I wouldn't advertise. But you know, we have this now. I mean, if I'm filling in an application for a visa to some country, and there's a line that says nationality, they really want to know my citizenship.
Yes.
You know, so this is getting somewhat vague. But you know, it used to be said in Soviet propaganda that the Soviet Union is actually a United Nations of its own, with all of these different nationalities. The interesting thing about this, if I can use the term demotion of Minzu from nationality to ethnic group, is that it did not happen in Chinese. The term remains the same in Chinese, and it's, in a sense, a very interesting kind of manipulation using the English language. I mean, look, there's, you know, the use of language, you know, in this area is very, very complex, and one of the more important issues, one of the more interesting issues, is the whole idea of Han. You know, Han, which, you know, in many ways is a synonym for Chinese, now is a subcategory of Chinese. You know, 100 years ago, if you looked at a Chinese English dictionary, it would say Hanying Zidian, because Han was, you know, meant Chinese. You wouldn't have to look, say, okay, I have a Chinese English dictionary. I wonder if it's a Mongolian Chinese English dictionary, or if it's a Tibetan Chinese English dictionary, and not trilingual, but basically Tibetan as a subunit of Chinese. A colleague of mine once made the interesting observation. He said that the term Han Chinese is usually used when one wants to make the point that some other group belongs to China. So they'll talk about, you know, Han and Tibetan, blah, blah, blah. But if you're talking about something going on in Beijing, you won't say the Han people, you'll say the Chinese people. Language, you know, of course language is shifting all the time. What I find interesting about, you know, the whole business of Minzu is that, like many other issues, many other instances in Sino-Tibetan relations, modern Sino-Tibetan relations, it's a conscious manipulation of the language. But the Chinese authorities have been very astute in this, so that in 1951 they signed this agreement with the Tibetans, which is often referred to as, you know, the 17-point agreement. And they were very, very careful to label it an agreement, not a treaty. But I hear Tibetans referring to it as a treaty, you know, a Chingyik, you know, a treaty. They really, the Tibetans were really unequipped for any of this when they signed it in 1951. I mean, the team that went there was very poorly equipped for this. And another interesting thing about it relates to the name of Tibet. The Tibetan word for China is Gyana. And, you know, you have Pe, as I mentioned, and then China is Gyana. And that traditionally is, Pe is Tibet and Gyana is China. And at the 17-point agreement, because the Tibetan language did not have a term whose field of meaning encompassed both Tibet and China. Now, within China, this is, again, manipulative. 100 years before the 17-point agreement, most Chinese would say that Tibet belonged to China, not that it was China, but it belonged to China, or it belonged to the Qing. And so at that signing of the 17-point agreement, they actually came up with a simple transcription into Tibetan script of the name Zhongguo. And that's been the case ever since. And previously, that was not the term that was used whenever China was discussed. But they and again, you know, the Tibetan side was very poorly prepared. They seem not to have realized what the implications of that would be.
There's another question in the back somewhere.
Yes, in your first part of your presentation, you often mentioned Tibet belongs to China. And my question is, nowadays the Western governments, they always talk about Tibet being a part of People's Republic of China.
Yeah, I was not saying that after much research, my opinion is that Tibet belongs to China. I was saying that this is the case that is made. And so when did, under that case, when did Tibet become a part of China? Maybe I should put air quotes around it.
My question is quite a different one.
Yeah.
My question is, it's obvious that Western governments always consider Tibet as a part of People's Republic of China. And especially when His Holiness visits the Western countries, and then the Western governments always consider the same statements. Or, for example, when Western leaders visit China, do you see any significant differences being said whether Tibet is a part of China or Tibet being part of People's Republic of China? Is there any political significance or meaning? Why they talking about People's Republic of China? So given the fact that PRC was established in 1950s, what is your personal view or opinion on that?
Of what is my view of Tibet being a part of the People's Republic of China, or
of that statement?
Oh,
said by Western governments.
Well, this is very complex. When one says, and I've heard both, by the way. I've heard both, not just People's Republic of China, but I've heard Tibetan politicians in Dharamsala saying we accept that Tibet is a part of China. Now, they'll finesse it, they'll say we accept that Tibet is a part of China, not that Tibet was a part of China, but that Tibet is a part of China. This is something which, of course, when the Tibetan government in exile, when the Dalai Lama says that Tibet is a part of the People's Republic of China, that basically ends the argument. It then becomes an internal issue. A human rights issue, perhaps, but an internal issue. And I don't know if that is the feeling of all Tibetans. I'm not a Tibetan, so it's not for me to say Tibet should or should not be a part of China. This is something for Tibetans broadly speaking, not just for one or two people. I've said this, with people have asked me this also with regard to the Uyghurs. I'm now banned from China. Not because of anything that I've said with regard to Tibet, because I'm also critical of the Tibetan administration in Dharamsala. Although I have to say that my criticisms of the Tibetans in Dharamsala and of the People's Republic of China in Beijing, whatever complaints I have, one is like a flea and the other is like a dinosaur. I think there's a lot of petty corruption and nepotism and all of that in Dharamsala, but nobody's being executed, nobody's being tortured, nobody's being thrown into jail. So, I always have to keep these, somewhat separate. But a people like the Uyghurs, and I would say like the Tibetans, who have been so mistreated since 1951 for the 17-point agreement. From that point on, have to have a say. I think it's the only reasonable, the only humane thing is to say that they really have to have a say in their future and what their future is. The public statement and the Tibetan administration, all up and down, they all say. Samdong Rinpoche said something to the point. I remember, I can't wait to be a national minority in China. First of all, China does not want the Dalai Lama back under any circumstances. They don't care what he says. They don't want him back, and there are understandable reasons for that. And they don't want the Tibetan administration back, and they think they have the upper hand. They have, how should I say? you know, in some sense, they've manipulated the Dalai Lama. So they've gotten the statement that they want, that he says that Tibet is a part of China. What they don't particularly like, but to be quite frank, they don't want him back. So there's always this, oh, the Dalai Lama has to do this, the Dalai Lama has to do that. There was a time when they said the Dalai Lama has to accept that Tibet is a part of China and that Taiwan is a part of China. Now, what the Dalai Lama has to do with the status of Taiwan, you know, but they're just basically more and more conditions because they don't want him back. And for a long time, this worked. I mean, now they don't really need it anymore, but there was a time when the Dalai Lama would say, I do not support independence, Tibet should be a part of China, I am not a separatist, etc., etc., etc. And now, if someone from the foreign ministry in Beijing were to say Tibet, you know, is a part of China, in those days people would say, well, that's Chinese propaganda. Of course, that's the Chinese position. And so they, rather than have their own people do it, they would say the Dalai Lama is not sincere. He has to say that clearly and loudly. And the Dalai Lama would go to George Bush, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and he would repeat this, and the effect would be essentially to undermine the position about Tibet's status in a way that no Chinese official could in terms of discussion. And they were very happy. They got that to work. They would simply, and you know, the Dalai Lama unfortunately would say, oh, China doesn't understand me. They don't understand that I don't want independence. To which I have to say, they understand the Dalai Lama very well. They have hundreds, maybe thousands of people, you know, in nationality affairs, in the foreign ministry. Every single word that the Dalai Lama says is parsed. They understand him very well. This was being very manipulative. It's in Dharamsala where they didn't understand China. And they still don't. If I may say so, the Dalai Lama's understanding of China is somewhat naive, even now. You don't have people trained in, you know, Chinese politics, Chinese political science. For a long time in Dharamsala, you would have people who, because they came out of Tibet under Chinese, you know, under Chinese administration, they could speak Chinese, they could read Chinese. And so they would be the ones who would be in charge of this, but they were not necessarily trained in politics or anything else. And now, essentially because the Dalai Lama says that Tibet is a part of China, everybody falls into line. And if I may say so, the Tibetan side, I'm sorry, this is getting to be a bit political. The Tibetan side has basically lost its leverage. The most important thing, the question of Tibet's status, has already been conceded. China's policy now is simply to wait for the Dalai Lama to pass away. Now, I know this is upsetting, but that really is their policy. And he's been extremely naive about this. Every time there's a change in the government of China, there's always word out of Dharamsala that so-and-so you know, understands Tibet better. I mean, you would hear things such as Xi Jinping's father was the Dalai Lama's good friend. Therefore, you know, we're very optimistic. Hu Jintao served in Tibet. Therefore, he should understand it better. We're very optimistic. And, you know, the naivete in all of this is, you know, is unfortunate. I'm sorry, I wish I could say something more optimistic, but look, you know, the other week we had this election in my country and I'm feeling terrible, so you know, I want to share the misery.
Shall we? Please, yes.
On Tibetan modernity, could you elaborate?
Yeah, you know, there's, you know, again, I think that this was a, you know, had things gone differently, you might really have seen the beginning of a kind of Tibetan modernity as you were seeing elsewhere. In Mongolia, also in China, where, you know, modern ideas, science, even ideas about democracy. Again, you can see this in even if you go to you know, Sun Yat-sen. You know, you can see the influence of Western democratic ideas. People were toying with things. Kang Youwei in China. But you really don't see the same sort of thing happening in Tibet. And I think this is because of the reimposition of very much of a religious government. If Polanyi had continued, and I'm not saying that Polanyi was a Democrat, I mean, no, but you know, you had a secular ruler, somebody who ruled actually over a very, very large area of Tibet. You had a greater sense of unification. Ideas about what the world was, you know, in terms of mapping, which contradicted, of course, traditional Tibetan Buddhist beliefs about the nature of the world, these were coming in as well. So I think the ground was there. It was very much there. But, you know, there's this obscurantism. I could also point to the early 20th century, the experiment with the school in Gyantse, which was shut down, that people actually introduced a sort of modern curriculum in Gyantse, and the monastic element felt threatened, with the result that you know, those who could, meaning wealthy aristocrats, did often send one or two of their children to school in Darjeeling or in Kalimpong, but one couldn't do this in Tibet. And you know, maybe I should go back, you know, to what I was saying before. You know, it might have also led to a modern sense of nationalism. You know, I sometimes feel that the Tibetan government that acquiesced to the 17-point agreement did not really understand that in the modern world, everything has to be neatly defined. They thought they could still exist within ambiguities. But China was doing away with those ambiguities, just as once upon a time the boundary of a state could be vague. You know, some water here, some field, something, you know, it didn't have to be demarcated, but we're now in the age where, quote unquote, every single centimeter of the sacred soil of the motherland, and pick your soil and pick your motherland, whatever it is, now becomes an issue all over the world. And I feel that the Tibetans were treating China in many ways, you know, the way they felt towards the Manchus, that they would be subject to them, but you know, good God, they would not be Chinese. I mean, now it's, you know, it takes in issues of identity which didn't exist at the time. Perhaps, you know, there were some people in Tibet. There were some far-sighted people in Tibet, but I think that most of the people politically did not really appreciate exactly what it meant, what they were signing away. You know, in old empire, you know, one never, you know, no British imperialist would say Indians are British. They say they're British subjects. But you know, imperialism being such a bad word now, you have to be citizens of a unitary multinational state. So again, it's a subcategory. So maybe ethnic, well, maybe ethnic group now. The charade of nationality is being swept away.
Any further comments or questions? Yes.
You mentioned that you were interested in the trade of silver between Tibet and China, and I have a question: why is it? And do you have a hypothesis? And also, as a conclusion, what's the reason? When did Tibet become a part of China?
I once wrote an editorial after 2008 for the New York Times, and I basically said that Tibet was part of the empires of the Mongols and the Manchus, but it was not a part of China until Mao Zedong sent his armies in to make it so. So there's a question of conquest there. But you know, my point, you know, in writing that was that again, Tibet had been part of the empires, but neither Manchus nor Mongols had detached Tibet or had attached Tibet to the Chinese portion of the empire, which is why you have all of this confusion That's why, or incoherence in trying to fix a time within the People's Republic of China when they can say Tibet became a part of China. Again, as I say, this is in the New York Times. You could check it, so I'm on record for that. I said, Tibet was not a part of China until Mao Zedong marched in and made it so. In terms of the silver, silver was valuable. It was valuable before New World silver came to China. But as it became pouring in, all of a sudden there were greater access to silver, greater resources, and so it just circulated much more commonly. And so silver then was given, it began to be given to Tibetan hierarchs who came to court and others who came on tribute missions, or who sent tribute missions from Tibet. So again, this is, late 16th century, into the mid-17th century. That's when it begins to come into Tibet. As I say, I don't have the full picture of this because it's very difficult to get these things out of Tibetan sources. I mean, even if I use the word search facility for the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center and I put in Mul, I'm sure I would get 500 million references, which would be almost as bad as not having the index. Maybe if I put in Mul J.
Well, yes.
If Minzu means ethnic or ethnic minority, what does Amdozu, for example, mean?
What is what?
Amdozu.
Amdozu.
Yeah, I just found it.
You found it?
Yeah, I found it in the internet.
Oh well, I'm sure somebody wrote Amdozu, but it's Amdozu is not one of the. There are 56 Minzu in the People's Republic of China, and there isn't an Amdozu. Or would it say Andor? Andor?
No, there's Qinghai Amdozu. And I was thinking, is there also a term like Kangzu?
No.
Huizu?
No. The what Zu? Hui. Oh, Hui. No. They do have Lopa and Mumba. These are considered, even though they're really subsets of Tibetans, and even Sherpa. They have Sherpa, but no. I mean, these are unofficial usages.
But isn't it misleading to if I'm Kamba?
Yeah.
To call myself I'm Zangzu, because Zang just refers to the outer part of
Okay, well, I'll tell you this. My comments about Tu Bo and Tu Fan come from a longer essay I wrote about the name of Tibet. When we published, I don't know if you know the book Authenticating Tibet by Katja Befetri and Anne-Marie Blondeau. The Chinese title, the French title was, I think, Le Tibet est-ce qu'il est chinois, or something like that. It was a much more provocative title, but it was basically written by a group of scholars, of Tibetologists, as a response to 100 questions and answers on Tibet, which had been published in the People's Republic of China. And it's now available in Tibetan. The Library of Tibetan Works and Archives did a translation, and there's a Chinese translation that was published in Taiwan. And the question that you asked came up when when the translation was being made. What should the title be? Should it have Xizang? And I argued no. I said it should be Tubota, which is the same term that is used in the late Qing by Mongols and Manchus, but which really reflects this continuous usage going back from the Turks. And since this term Tubota is not uncommonly used in publications from Hong Kong and Taiwan, I successfully argued for it, but I wrote this essay to explain why it's not being called Xizang. And of course, Xizang, if you're speaking historically, then Xizang really is misleading, because Xizang refers only to the TAR. And in fact, within the People's Republic of China, only if you're from the TAR, the autonomous region, can you say, I am Xizang Ren, Nga Pepa Yin. If you're from Kham, then you're not Pepa, you're Purik. And which, it gets very awkward. It means somebody of Tibetan nationality. Whereas if you're speaking historically, then really Tubota covers it all. I should say that I was, and I should have thought about this earlier, but I gave a lecture at Minzu University in 2011 when I was still allowed to go, and I did a couple of times use the term Xizang when I really shouldn't have, and one of the students came up to me, an Amdawa, and said, you shouldn't be saying Xizang, then you're not including me. And if I may say so, I found that the students at Mirik Lobja, they really had Semshu. Rather than, of course, she came up to me afterwards. She didn't raise her hand and say, why are you calling me, and the lecture was in Chinese, but, and that's why I used Xizang. I would have said Tibetan. If I were speaking in English, I just simply would have said Tibetan. Tibet and Tibetan, but yeah, it's an issue.
So the next time when a Chinese person asks me, what are you, where are you from, can I say I'm Tubor? No. I'm against the use of Tubor. Tuborta. Yeah, Tuborta. And then the person's going to say, Shamaran Nishanai Guajaren. They may very well say, what is that? But if you want, do you read Chinese? Okay, the translation was Jibi de Tuborta, uncovering Tibet, exposing Tibet. You can take a look at that book, and you'll get the introduction is by me, and it explains, in large part, why we're using Tuborta rather than Xizang. And there are a number of bloggers whom you'll see within China and outside of China who use Tuborta.
Well, there are no further questions. I don't see any hands raised. Let's thank Professor Sperling again for this interesting talk.